All right, welcome to the first lecture of the spring. For those of you who are wondering what happened to the lecture that we were supposed to have when we had a snow day, which I know you're all bummed about, that lecture is actually going to happen next fall. So the new affiliates, we couldn't make it work for this spring, but they're going to come, I think, next fall. So you will, if anyone was looking forward to that, like I was, don't worry, it will happen. All right, but today we have Liz Ogbu of Studio O, so I just want to give you a little bio. Liz is a globally recognized expert on repairing unjust urban environments, from transforming a low-income housing development on the grounds of a former plantation in Charlottesville, to reimagining struggling public spaces navigating the post-apartheid landscape of Durban, South Africa. Liz has a long history of working with communities to leverage the power of design to catalyze community healing and collective thriving. She is founder and principal of Studio O, a multidisciplinary design practice that works at the intersection of racial and spatial justice. In addition, Liz has held academic appointments at several leading universities, and in 2023 was an inaugural university fellow at the University of Virginia. Liz has written for and been profiled in publications such as the New York Times, U.S. News & World Report, and on NPR. Her projects have been featured in museum exhibitions and received numerous design awards globally. Liz's honors include TED Woman Speaker, Aspen Ideas Scholar, and Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center Resident. In 2025, she received an honorary doctorate from the Minneapolis College of Art and Design and was named Manzanita Fellow for Racial, Economic, Environmental Justice at Mesa Refuge. Her TED and TEDx talks, which share a creative process rooted in community wisdom and healing, have been viewed over 1 million times. So let's give a warm OU welcome to Liz Ogbu.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. How are you doing?
All right.
Somebody's enthusiastic, which is great. So I'm really excited to be here and share a little bit about my work. I'm a big fan of quotes. I collect a lot of them. And as I was trying to think of what I wanted to share today, I felt it appropriate to start with a little James Baldwin. So, the world is before you, and you need not take it or leave it as it was when you came in. And I would pair that with this other James Baldwin quote: an old world is dying, and a new one, kicking in the belly of its mother, time, announces that it is ready to be born. This birth will not be easy, and many of us are doomed to discover that we are exceedingly clumsy midwives. No matter, so long as we accept that our responsibility is to the newborn, the acceptance of responsibility contains the key to the necessary evolving skill. So James Baldwin wrote that in the 1960s, and yet it still seems like something that is appropriate for some of the things that we're witnessing today. This idea that things are in a great state of change, and old systems that we have been used to relying on are actually collapsing. And it brings forth this question of, well, what are we supposed to do? And how do we engage? And I think what Baldwin is challenging us to do with both this quote and the one before it is that part of our purpose and part of our calling of showing up in this time is to actually reimagine, well, what is the world that we would actually like to see? And to be participants, not bystanders, in supporting that change to come about. And so I know, as much as there is a sense of upheaval about some of the things that we're witnessing in our screens and on social media today, I want to also say that the lecture I'll give today is probably the same lecture I would have given a month ago or a year ago or 2 years ago, because part of the calling to be able to do the work to reimagine the world, to support possibilities where everyone, no matter what identity they hold or where they live, can thrive, has always been a core part of my work, and part of what I always try to bring as a message to all of you who are students, that you have the capacity to engage in. So as I take you through a tour of a couple of my projects, I want you to kind of hold that and hold what it means to be agents who are participating and supporting the change to come about. So a huge underpinning of my work is this theory of spatial justice. I did not come up with it. It was coined by Edward Soja, who is a geographer. And it essentially means that justice has a geography. and the equitable distribution of access, services, and outcomes should be a basic human right. And so when we look around in a lot of our cities, and also I would say rural areas, we often see a geography of harm. So which communities are the ones that often get power plants built in them, or have insufficient transportation, or have more vacant lots than nice parks. And I also think that we can't look at them in isolation, because it's not that we don't have the resources where everybody could get access to those things, they're just unevenly distributed. And so I think it's important that we talk both about the geography of harm, but also about the geography of benefit. Which communities get the gleaming office towers, the multi-million-dollar transit centers, the nice parks, and how do we talk about creating a system of distribution where everyone has access to the resources that would support them to thrive? So when I talk about spatial justice, it's about looking at both the places where there are conditions of injustice and how to bring them into a right relationship with place so that they can be filled with just as much just resources and opportunities as any other place, regardless of who lives there. So the first project I wanted to take you through is called Now Hunters Point. It was a project that I worked on for 10 years. And I was joking with some students that I met with at lunch that I have a habit of, even if I go into a community and intend originally just that I'm going to do the project for a few months, almost all my projects end up lasting years. And that's partly, I think, if you're in architecture, landscape architecture or planning, it takes a long time to get things built. And so part of it is actually doing the time to be in relationship with the community and the place to see it through. So my work isn't just at the beginning when drawings are getting drawn, but I stay all the way through. And it allows me to build really lasting relationships with the community, and you'll also see it impacts some of the ways in terms of the decisions of the things that we do to support the projects. So this project is located in San Francisco. It's on the site of a former power plant, which you see up on the drawing. It's located in a community called Bayview Hunters Point, which is in the southeastern edge of San Francisco. So it's kind of the industrial neighborhood. It was a classic example of what the lack of spatial justice looks like. So this neighborhood had a plethora of industrial uses. Besides this power plant, it also has one of the largest sewage treatment plants near a residential neighborhood in the country. And then it also had a naval shipyard that built and deconstructed nuclear ships and then became a Superfund site. It also, San Francisco, as you might have heard, has a high cost of living. So the pre-pandemic average home price was $1.5 million in the city. The average median income in this neighborhood was $63,000. It was primarily an African-American neighborhood, many of whom had come into the neighborhood during the 1940s to work in the shipyards. And many of them lived in housing on the hill just above the power plant. That housing, following World War II, ended up becoming public housing. But they essentially were the barracks that were then converted to public housing, and they just went through a redevelopment process. So there was a lot of things that you could say were about unjust issues. And in the 1990s, the community, a coalition of broad stakeholders led by mothers living in that public housing, actually fought for the closure of this plant. They were successful. It was torn down. And what ended up happening is that when it was torn down, the land was cleaned and then capped with asphalt until the utility company could figure out what to do. I and a team of 2 other firms were hired at that point to propose interim uses because of a variety of things. It was going to be years before the land could be developed. And so we really treated community members as our clients, and we treated this project as an opportunity not just to do let's have a fun festival here and there, or let's put up a little park, but how could we actually do activities that would engage the community, give them some sort of benefit, and actually use the process of activating the land to ask what they wanted to see on the land in the future. So we did everything from job training workshops to yoga days with kids and a backpack giveaway to an annual circus, which was a big hit. And the cool thing about it is that it really changed the dynamic of the neighborhood in that site. I think for a lot of people, this was sort of like a no-go area. There had been a huge kind of culture or problem with violence happening in the streets. And so to be able to have a site that was turned from a community blight into a source of pride was really great. And even things like the circus, where when we first proposed it to the client, they were like, "You want to do a what on the land, like a circus?" And they were highly skeptical, and we just said, "Look, let us do it. If it fails, then we'll never do it again." We ended up getting 1,000 people at that first circus. It was folks from the neighborhood, but it was also folks who normally would never step foot in that neighborhood, but they all kind of came. And the energy around it was something that people weren't used to seeing in many spots within the neighborhood. And so while at those events, we would often have engagement stations. And so part of the idea with these events is, rather than going and holding boring community meetings, sorry to those of you who love community meetings, but community meetings where the interaction is highly transactional. The idea was like, how do we create something that can actually be a benefit to the community? And while they're there, we actually engage people in conversations about what they want to see. A lot of that engagement led to the first permanent project that was able to move forward, which was actually on the edge of the site. It was a shoreline that the company hadn't remediated yet. And so as they were moving into the process of remediation, we said, let's not just clean the soil, let's actually upgrade it. We also knew that there was a larger project called the Blue Greenway in San Francisco, which is the idea of rehabbing all the shoreline in San Francisco to create a publicly accessible waterfront that goes from the northern tip of San Francisco to the southern tip of San Francisco. And so as part of that, what we wanted to do in this neighborhood is actually set a standard of what that could be. And particularly in this community, the power plant had been a separator, and a lot of the industrial uses had been a separator from the waterfront. So we were talking about ways to actually give people access. And I think it was interesting in some of our conversations with the company early on. It was like, well, okay, we can put grass, we can put benches, and we're like, no, we want to create some place that can be beautiful and be a source of pride, because it's important to also set a standard for any other public space that could be done in a neighborhood. It's not just about like, oh, let's give them a few things here and there. It's like, let's actually give people beauty and say that they are deserving, as much deserving as beauty as someone who's living in another part of San Francisco that perhaps has a higher per capita income. So at those events, we use those as our community meetings for the design of the shoreline. We engage people in conversations about what they wanted to see. One of the things that they often said in the interviews that we had with them was that they felt that a lot of the history was being lost as people died or moved away from the neighborhood, and people had no idea of all the important things that had happened in this neighborhood. So there was a huge push to do interpretive signage. So the middle photo that you see actually tells the story of the community fight to tear down the power plant. And then also we did an oral history project, and a lot of quotes from those oral histories are actually embedded in the benches on the landscape. So the idea was also, as people come into the neighborhood, whether they live there or they're visitors coming in, they're all confronted with the stories of this community and they're embedded in it. And so the idea was, like, by ensconcing the stories in physical architecture, the stories would not be lost. But I think an important thing to note is, like, on the one hand, I can share all of these like really beautiful pictures of smiling kids and say, oh, great, look at the architecture or the spaces that we created. But I think it is important to acknowledge when we hit speed bumps in our projects. And I would say in this community, one of the things we realized about 5 years into the work was just because we were creating moments of joy, and in particular Black joy, doesn't mean that there also wasn't great moments of loss. So in the first couple of years as we were working in this community, it was also experiencing massive gentrification. That crazy home price value that I mentioned in San Francisco meant that people were constantly looking for where could they get bargains to be able to afford to buy in the city. And as this was one of the last neighborhoods in San Francisco with affordable real estate, it became a place where people were moving in and pricing those who had lived here for decades out of there. And so there was a lot of anger of what that means. And there was a lot of fear about the future of this site, that it could potentially become a place that would usher in more gentrification rather than stop it. And so we had to engage that as the project. And there was I talk about it in the TED Talk, horrific community meeting that happened, where on the one hand I was like, well, wait, we've created all these amazing things. But on the other hand, we still hadn't addressed the deep and profound grief that people were feeling about what was happening to their neighborhood. And we realized that that also had to be the story of how we thought about this project and conversations that we engaged people in. I love this quote by Charlene Carruthers, because I think it really speaks to that, of like, when we tell incomplete stories of who we are and where we've been, we have incomplete solutions. So there's a way in which, like, if we think about our projects only being about the good news and the success stories, we can move forward in trying to create things that actually don't encompass the full story of who these communities are. And as a result, we might actually miss the mark in the solutions that we're trying to propose. So a huge thing that shifted in my work around this project and future projects I would do is, like, how do we embrace that more complicated story and make it part of how we understand what we need to do to move forward. So as a result, in this project, that included going back to some of the earlier things that we had done in the project, like a partnership with StoryCorps to do an oral history effort, and actually saying that that process of hearing the stories, understanding the stories, could actually give us some of the insights into the complicated issues that people were facing. We also started a multi-year grief and reckoning effort that included a partnership with the Question Bridge Black Males Project, which actually, it's a national project that was done over a series of years, interviews with thousands of black men, talking about issues connected to race, identity, and belonging, and it resulted in a kind of giant video installation that's in the permanent collection of many museums around the country. And what probably wasn't known is that several of the men actually came from the Bayview, but that exhibit had never been shown in the Bayview. So we kind of used it as an anchor point and created Question Bridge Bayview, where we did a season-long series of activations where we engaged people in questions around belonging and identity as it related to both the site and the neighborhood. And then we were finally shut down by the utility company after about 10 years. And so we thought what we wanted to do was some way to use that as a way to talk about the grief and where this community could go from here. And so we secured a grant from the Kenneth Rainin Foundation and did a season long of continuing to ask people questions about identity and belonging, and then fueled that into a day-long public installation and performance that took place on the new park that we had built. So what you see on the bottom, middle, and right are two pieces from that performance that were about reflecting those words back to people using art and active engagement. One of the things I also like to do with a lot of my projects is to make sure that we're creating collateral that's not just like, ooh, look at this amazing cool thing that we've done, but can actually be tools to advance conversations. So knowing that we were leaving the project when it was closing and not knowing what the utility company was going to do, we wanted to find a way to share back to the community all the data that we had collected over the years. And so we created this pamphlet for action that synthesized the highlights that it could exist as a record for any future development that might be attempted. And then we also gave people a blueprint of how the development process tends to work to help inform them of, here are the things you need to watch out for, here are the places where you can get engaged. You'll see there's a lot of drawings. And one of the things with this project and a lot of my projects is I also try to create active opportunities to engage kids, because kids are often the future of who might be living in a neighborhood, and they're not the type who are going to come to the community meeting and give us input, but they still have valuable things to say. So on all of my projects, there's often a component where we're actually doing workshops with kids of a variety of ages, from teenagers to young kids, and actually taking in what they say, what they draw, and treating it as data that we can also use to inform decisions of what we do. So this was given out in the community at the day of that event, and it's also available online. Idea that it can support this community, but it's also meant to be a guide for any other community who's looking at similar issues. The next project I want to talk about is the Inner Belt, which is located in Akron, Ohio. So it's this is the Inner Belt. It's a highway that was built in the 1970s, runs just past downtown Akron, which you can see in the distance. And the land that it was built used to be a black neighborhood. It's part of the, unfortunately, classic story that we've seen in this country of a lot of the highways that were built, particularly during the national highway boom between the 1950s and 70s, often displaced communities, and in large proportion displaced black and people of color communities. The estimates of how many people were displaced between the 1950s and 80s is, not firm, but one article in the LA Times cited that it's probably likely over 1 million people across the country were displaced by these kinds of projects. In Akron, it was almost 1,000 families and businesses, as well as several sociocultural institutions. The Inner Belt never ended up carrying as many cars as it was supposed to carry, and actually never ended up getting finished the way it was supposed to be finished, and ran out of money. But the people have been displaced. In the 2016, the highway, or at least the northern end of the highway, was decommissioned. It reached the end of its useful life, and the city felt that actually city and state felt that rather than investing additional money, it would be better to decommission it and see what they could do with the land. I was brought in 2020, actually based on what a former deputy mayor had seen of the work in San Francisco, because in that project I talked so much about healing, and the city had a sense that that healing would actually be required for this project. So when I started working on the project, one of the things that I often do when I go into work in a community is I try to understand who's the most impacted population. And they're the group that I often begin my conversations with. I often describe that I have two clients in every project, the people who cut the checks and the people who are most impacted by the things that I do. And our system of working with clients as architects or planners often privileges the first one, and then the second one we engage when we have community meetings. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to make it seem like I hate community meetings. I actually do find they're useful, but I think if they're the only way that we default to connecting with people, they often leave us with insufficient information that we need to create projects that can really support communities to thrive. So I often try to identify who's most impacted, how do I go to them, and how do I give them power in the process in order to be able to allow them to also dictate the things that we do. So in this case, it was about trying to understand the black community that had existed before. And I would say part of why it was so important in this project, I mean, it's important in every project, but here, so a lot of those highways that were built in the mid-20th century are actually reaching the end of their useful life right now. And there are questions that are emerging in a number of communities about what to do. Do you retrofit them and maybe expand them to meet the traffic needs now? Or do you take them away and build giant greenways and boulevards? But I think the thing that we've seen with some of the projects that have moved ahead, when they take these approaches, they're often looking at, well, the highest and best use is creating something that feels like economic development or something that feels pretty, and then everything will follow on after that. But it often never goes back to the people who were most harmed by the action to build the highway in the first place. And so part of what I wanted to change with this project was actually going back to those people and asking, well, you know, is that where you want us to end up? Or is there something that would be more befitting of the loss that you experienced? The loss in this case, in the context that we couldn't separate ourselves from, was the history of the neighborhood and the decision to put a highway through it. So this neighborhood had been known kind of referringly as Little Harlem. It was the primary black neighborhood in Akron at the time. It was also known as the Jazz District because Akron was located on the Cross-Continental Railroad route. When acts would play in Detroit, like Ella Fitzgerald, Duke Ellington, etc., as they took the train to go to New York, they would stop off in Akron and play at the jazz clubs there. So it was like really this super vibrant neighborhood. When the decision to put the highway through it came, there were other routes that were looked at. And part of the decision through this was that it was viewed as, this neighborhood was kind of also seen as a neighborhood of blight. And so if you could put it through, you would both accomplish getting people to downtown faster and connecting them to the new and mostly white suburbs outside of town, but you would also create a regenerative project for an area that was seen as being, quote unquote, the ghetto. So I also find this picture a really interesting juxtaposition, right? The neighborhood, and then who made the decision that the neighborhood should no longer exist. So that was the context that actually set up the highway, and it was really important to engage that, because if I was to go into and talk to former residents, this is what they had in their mind. And so any conversation about what we wanted to do next had to be, how are we not being that? Another thing that I encountered very early on into the project was that there was a really horrific police shooting in 2022 where Jayland Walker was killed when the police shot over 60 bullets into his body. And so that really activated the community, and for them it was like, okay, here we go yet again. You know, if the inner belt and putting the highway through the black neighborhood was seen as a kind of assault on the black neighborhood, this was it. The idea was like, it just continues. So one of the things that we had to do with this project was really communicate that we were coming in a different way, and that we were committed to holding the hurt and the grief, because a lot of it was long-standing. So in the engagement efforts, it was going and finding former residents, like, appearing at senior buildings where I had heard some residents were, or starting an advisory group that was made up of a diversity of stakeholders, but half of which were former residents, or going and running focus groups with young black professionals who had also inherited this culture of harm. And one of the things that we found is that in the 50 years it had been since the highway had been built, very few people talked about it, even within the black neighborhood. And when I started asking why, a lot of them said it had just been too painful to talk about it. So you had younger generations who had no idea about Little Harlem and the jazz clubs. You also had others in Akron who weren't members of the black community who had no idea about the neighborhood that had preceded it, because it was almost as if it had been erased from the history. And so when we started bringing it up, before and then after Jayland Walker's death, for a lot of people it started to be like, how do we get to be the city where these things are valued, both in terms of the places and the people who inhabited them? And how do we hold the grief? And it was interesting because I would say the grief that I was starting to find with some of the former residents was grief that the entire Akron community, regardless of race, started to feel after Jayland's death. And so there was this really interesting thing about, like, how do we all collectively hold the grief and use it as a tool to be able to ask, how do we build better? So as I mentioned, there was kind of this continuous process of going in and engaging people in conversations and trying to create a forum at which we could tell stories, not of what you wanted to see when the highway was replaced, but actually helping understand what was lost when the highway came through. Because I often think when you come in and people are angry about things, it's not so much that they're angry about what you're trying to do, they're angry about what they've experienced in the past. And so if we can actually create space for those stories to come to the surface, it actually allows us to create conditions that help us move forward, because when they see that those stories are honored and held, it gives them hope that you will honor and hold them as well. So you see on the left is one of our senior building focus groups. We also were part of a group that created the very first, and hopefully there'll be more, Inner Belt Reunion. So it was at the Urban League, which had a space just off the Inner Belt. And we sent an open invitation to anyone who had lived in the neighborhood to come. And we did a day of events and oral history recordings and blessings. And And then you can also see in the middle, I like to think about what are creative ways in which I can do engagement and ask people questions about what they've experienced or what they miss. So one of the things, I took this idea that it was really hard to find information about the old neighborhood because it had not really been preserved in any one place. So we worked with the city to create a map of the buildings that they did know exist, and then we took it around to different events, and we actually had people write what businesses and beloved activities used to be in different places. And that's in large part because when you go into directories, the things that are captured are often who owned the building, not what business actually was in it. And so it was really interesting that if people were like, oh, wow, that was where the custard stand used to be. Oh, my God, I used to go there and do blah, 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 blah. Or that was Margie's, had amazing barbecued pig feet. Like, it just like would really get them super engaged and tell more stories about the neighborhood, but also the fact that we were trying to recreate a map of the neighborhood that was lost actually became an important, significant piece for people, both in terms of understanding the things we were trying to memorialize, but also for people who had never experienced the neighborhood, for them to also get a sense of what was lost. I do, as you probably could tell from the Hunters Point example, I like to do a lot of different activation work. And I think one of the things with architecture and planning is that we can talk about a thing, but it could be like 5, sometimes even 10 years before that thing actually comes into fruition. And so sometimes that's actually too long for people to visualize, especially if what you're proposing is a dramatic change of what a place is today. So I try to treat activation as a way to get people to imagine different realities of what a place could be, but also allow us to test out ideas of what we could possibly do in a place. So you see on the top is one of the things that people talked about is like, could we just make the inner belt into a giant park? So we had an event where we partnered with the city's park departments to turn the inner belt into a park for a day. Granted, you don't see any grass, but the idea was like actually trying to create some different activities that would get people to engage it. And one of the things that was really interesting is because it had been decommissioned and not used as a highway, it also had been left open, but nobody had actually been able to get onto the land. So for some people, actually being able to get on the land and experience it in that way allowed them to give ideas and thoughts of what they wanted to see in a way they couldn't when they were just looking down at it as a highway. On the bottom, we partnered with the jazz festival that was running in the city. And as I mentioned, the inner belt went over an area that had been the jazz district back in the day. And so we actually got the festival to put one of their stages on the highway and invited people to come back. We had a panel where we brought in people who had a connection to that old neighborhood. So the woman that you see had actually grown up in the Matthews Hotel, which was the lone hotel where black people could stay back in the day. So she talked about, having to go and fetch something for Ella Fitzgerald in the downtown and what it was like to see all these jazz greats come through. And the guy that you see sitting next to her was a long-time jazz musician in the city. And so the idea was to through bringing back these activations, we could actually allow people to inhabit the space of the types of experiences and programs that both were key to what the neighborhood had been, but also might open up the floodgates for what people could imagine in the future. So on the left, you can see sort of this is what happened when they started clearing through the neighborhood. And as you can see, it created a pretty significant scar. And on the right, one of the things that we wanted to do is, since most people only in Akron only know of it as the highway, so post the neighborhood that existed before this, we wanted to bring forth people who could tell us stories of what it used to be. So we also secured funding to be able to launch an oral history project, partnering with the local library. And we set out to interview anybody who had lived in the neighborhood and had a story to tell. We also made all of those stories available online. So the idea is that anyone can go and listen to the stories. The full collections exist in the library archives, but online what you can get is we edit it down almost to the story, like the StoryCorps clips that you get on NPR every Friday morning. And what we did is we kind of created two pieces. One was the displacement story, so what it was like when people had to leave and what did they feel. And the other one was remembering the neighborhood, because I think sometimes when we do talk about what was lost, we focus on the moment of loss. And we focus on the terrible story. But I think in order to understand why people were so passionate about the loss, you actually had to understand the full extent of what was lost. So the remembering the neighborhood is people describing what the neighborhood used to be like. And I would say one note about these oral histories, and any time I do storytelling in projects, I don't use them just to create cool artifacts that people can check into, although that's great. But for me, I often remember what Brene Brown said, in which stories are data with a soul. So you can get all the statistics in the world, but understanding what's behind the statistics, how they actually tell you about a place or what people desire, a lot of that can be found in stories. So often when I do storytelling in projects, it's a form of me doing research to understand what is precious and what is beloved, and I feel like people are very good at telling you what they need, but maybe not always as good at telling you what they want. And if you can understand what they want, that helps you understand what is the emotional quality you need to have around your projects. So basically, off of the work they did, we led a 2.5 year visioning effort, which then was all kind of put into a final report that was about 100 pages long. And the idea behind the report was not just to document everything that was done and give proposals for how to move forward, but I think also a lot of the work that I take on, I try to take on projects that can be models. And the idea is that I try to choose projects where we can push the envelope on what we're doing, we can disrupt the status quo, but I also want other communities to be able to learn from the risks that we take. And so the idea with the project is, as I mentioned, there are a ton of projects around the country that are looking at highways and what do you do after it. So the idea is that anyone would be able to tap into this and get examples, tips, tricks to be able to pursue a more community-centered, grief-accommodating project in their own city. And then the idea with this was also by having the document and having sort of the synthesis of the experience put into paper, it was also supposed to be a living and breathing document for the people of Akron, both the impacted residents, so that it's archiving what they said, what they hoped for, and what was taken from that. And then also for the rest of the community. I think part of the thing was like to make this not just be a story of those who were displaced, but it's Akron's story, and making everybody actually have collective ownership within that. And then these are just some pages of the thing. So on the backs of that work, the city was able to secure a grant through the Reconnecting Communities Project, which came out of the infrastructure law that was passed a number of years ago. They got $1 million grant that funded a master plan. What you see on the right was the community process to help select the team that would do the master plan. So we tried to continue that community voice piece all the way through. And I think one of the things I also want to echo about what the great thing of creating things that are artifacts of your process is, this was put up as one of the materials that any team responding to the master plan had to respond to. And you could see that based on this, that then led all the master plans to talk about grief and repair as part of the underlying ethos of the projects and the process that they were proposing to do. And then if you ever want to access any of the stuff, akroninterbelt.com kind of has all the materials we generated as part of the project. The final project that I'll talk about is Kindlewood, which is located in Charlottesville, Virginia. And it is started off as a 150-unit Section 8 property development located on 11 acres just south of downtown. It was over 80% African American, and at the time that we started, the average income was $10,600. It never had a significant renovation in the 40 or so years that it existed. And so my firm was brought in to partner with several people that you see below to try to figure out how do we redevelop it. And as I mentioned with the Akron project and also with the Hunters Point project, one of the things that I always do is try to understand, well, what is the context that we're building in? In this context, you know, the events of August 2017 with the Unite the Right incursion, this is 4th Street where Heather Heyer was killed, and a car was sort of rammed through a bunch of anti-racist protesters. The street in which she was killed is just 2 blocks north of Friendship Court, which is what it was called at the time. And so, and so that was something that a lot of people knew Charlottesville for. And a lot of people knew this area for it, but I think what was important was that like racism and its connection with place did not start in 2017. Charlottesville is a town that came into being by a series of plantations, and the site that we're working on actually was formerly the Garrett Square plantation. So that was kind of at the heart of already embedded in the landscape. And we would say also as we started to work, not on the land, but not far away, there used to be a neighborhood called Vinegar Hill, which was one of the primary black neighborhoods within Charlottesville that was raised through urban renewal in the 1950s and 60s. And so when we started to work and talk about redevelopment, a lot of the residents were like, oh, this is just, you're just going to try and displace us, just like Vinegar Hill. People just kept on bringing it over. So one of the things that we had to work through was how to build trust. How to say this was not going to be another Vinegar Hill. And so again, in my process, looking at who was the most impacted folks, it was the residents. So a lot of the early work was going into residents' homes and not just saying, oh, what do you want to see here, but actually having a conversation to understand their lives. I think when I talk about the fact that I'm often with projects for many, many years, it often has a lot to do with that's what it takes to build relationships. That's what it takes to connect with people. And you can't actually create change unless there's trust. And so going into people's homes, sitting and talking with them, not just about what the project's going to be, but what their lives are, was really about setting the conditions of trust so that they would tell me what they desired, what they hoped for, and that we could build a project that was zero displacement and actually echoed the things that they wanted to see and need. So from an architect's perspective, you know, there were clear things that we can think about, oh, we can make this better, right? Like, so this is what the inside of a typical unit would look like. They had a big green space that basically became a lake every time it rained because, of course, this was built on low-lying land. And so you give me this as a design problem, I can totally fix it. But that doesn't mean that what I would think to do here would actually match what residents wanted. So as we had conversations of what they wanted to see, it was trying to understand, yes, what are the parts that are within our skill set to fix, but then what are the intangibles that actually create redevelopment or use redevelopment as a tool to create a condition that supports people to thrive. I mentioned this to some of the students I was talking to at lunch, that the executive director of the nonprofit had said very early on, challenging all of us working on the project, is if all we do is build housing, we're just going to help the poor to be poor better. So oftentimes when we talk about housing, and particularly low-income housing, we sort of talk about, well, we just need to build units. If we build units of new housing, that is enough. That makes people's lives better. But if you just build new housing, the people are still living in the same condition, just with a better roof over their head. So what that meant is how do we look at doing redevelopment to be able to get things that support people to have better lives and be able to move up the income ladder. So this is part of what we came up with, and I would say we formed an advisory group of residents, and so they were co-decision makers along the way. And sometimes I think we don't include residents because we think they don't have the skills and it take too long to give them the skills. In this case, what we did is we trained up this group of residents to be able to make both architectural decisions but also economic decisions. So the decisions of creating this as a mixed income development. That was what the residents wanted, but they wanted to make sure that like it wasn't that you had a poor building over here and then the market rate building over here. They actually wanted the buildings to be mixed. So they were the ones who determined the income mix that they wanted. They were the ones who determined how big the property would be. And it did take longer, but I actually think what we got was a more quality project. And consistently, this has been the project that has received one of the highest tax credit, which is a sort of a form of funding that is in a rabbit hole that I won't go into here, but it would get one of the highest awards in the state of Virginia. And so I think sometimes clients, and you may hear people are a little skittish to take risk and do something different because they think, well, there's no way we can pay for that. But I would say invariably on my projects, we often end up getting significant pockets of funding because we demonstrate a different way of doing things that actually supports people to thrive. And so by not pursuing the status quo path, we actually open up the doors to do something that both achieves our aims and is fundable. So here are members of the advisory committee. We joke that that's their band cover photo on the left, which they all demanded that they got framed photos of. But I would say about a third of the committee has been with us since the very beginning. And then as folks have had to roll off, we've gotten new members. So they're invested in this too. And it's actually seeded other resident community committees to work on other things within the property. So it's actually built a whole system of resident empowerment that I think is giving them a hand in supporting how do we make this a community where people can thrive. I think one of the things, going back to that comment of if all we do is build housing, we're just helping the poor better, is that often when we talk about housing development, this is the goal, right? If we can build all of this housing, then we're great. One thing I didn't mention yet is that part of how we got this, it's a zero displacement development. Part of how we got to do that is it's a phased development. So we built on the green space and then built phase one, moved some residents over because every building is mixed. A third of the residents get to move each time we build a phase, and then new residents come in from the other income levels. So we've finished phase one. Phase two will open up later this year, and then we'll get to work on phase three, and we just started talking about what we want to do to phase four, but all residents will be rehoused by the end of phase three. But going back to the point, usually this is a goal. If we can build all of this, we're successful. I think for us, the idea is if we're centering the residents, we use redevelopment as a tool to be able to achieve other things. So this is something that we developed in concert with the residents, a series of spatial justice pillars. And so they wanted to make sure that when we do development, we look at what are programs that we can do and what are built environment things we can do that connect to generational wealth, shared voice and leadership, healing and well-being, culture of care and belonging. And you could see some of the programs that they brainstormed that they would like to see connected to that. And then this is a sort of snapshot of the culture of care and belonging. You can see the whole plethora of programs that they wanted to see come out of it. Some of them connect to physical space. Some of them just connect to activities that they wanted to see done. And on the right is a picture of them actually actively engaging within the design process of phase one. So I think that the thing with the projects, you'll see I do share some buildings or some spaces that have done, but a lot of my description of projects actually is much broader than that. And that is because I think if you set the goal of what you're trying to achieve is supporting communities to heal and thrive, there's a larger remit that you need to take. There's a larger set of things that you need to get invested in and think about as part of your project. So, for example, on the Kindlewood project in the last week, I've done everything from talk about, well, what's the process for how are we going to start brainstorming resident engagement around phase four, to working with a cross-departmental team to develop a strategy around relocation for phase two, to working with a new resident community committee that we created to select and team up with an artist to design a storytelling-centered art installation for the new park, right? Those are radically different things that are not usually part of what we call the remit for an architect, and yet if part of what we're looking at is this grander vision of supporting people, they are things that we need to get engaged in, and they're all things that use my design skills. So as I think about, this time that we're in, it seems like we've kind of shifted from this moment of where there may have been complacency, more broadly, about what's going on, and now we've been shifted into this moment of urgency. I want to argue that sometimes how we hold complacency and urgency is like actually two parts of the same coin, right? Urgency feels uncomfortable. And I think a lot of like what we might be experiencing of this time is we want to get past it as fast as possible and go back to normal, which I would argue normal was never great for a large number of people. And if we get into a state of complacency, it's like we don't want to remember some of these hard things because it might seem like we can't fix them. But I actually think if we think about James Baldwin's quotes, it is actually our remit to work on these projects, to try to engage and transform these environments with the skills that we have been given. So for me, when I think about what I'm doing, what's my purpose, and how I leverage my design skills in the world, I think of all the people that I've worked with as my clients, right? And this is the full definition of clients, not just people paid me, but the people who are impacted by what I do. And I carry them with me, and I feel like if I haven't actually made meaningful impact on their lives, then I haven't done my job. And you may think that, as you leave here, maybe your vision is you want to just do beautiful towers. That's cool. No judgment against the towers. But I would argue that in every project, there's a plethora of people who are impacted by that work, right? So in that tower, have you talked to the secretary who works in that tower? Have you talked to the janitor who cleans that tower? How have you incorporated their voices in what you're thinking? Part of our goal as architects, landscape architects and planners, and sorry for whoever I've forgotten, but part of our goal is actually to shape the built environment for the betterment of everyone. And so if you take anything from this talk, it's how do you create a process that allows you to include that everyone in your understanding of what the conditions are that you're responding to and what are the possibilities of what you can create. So building a more just, thriving future for all requires holding space to acknowledge, reckon with, and repair not only the present injustices, which are quite present for us now, but the past ones too. And it's a big job. I don't mean to say that any of the things that I presented were easy, but I also think it's what we're all being called to do. And so I would just invite that as you do your work, how do you make sure that the things that you are creating create more conditions that set the world right than adding to the conditions that make the world wrong? And since I ended with James Baldwin, I feel like I got to started with James Baldwin, so I'm going to end with Toni Morrison. This is precisely the time when artists go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal. I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it is important not to ignore its pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom, like art. Thank you. I'm told I can take questions.
Thank you so much. Questions?
I was going to ask you brought up the fact that community meetings were just one way to really connect with the community, but what are some other techniques that you found to be helpful?
Yeah, and I would say, like I said, I don't want to bash community meetings, but I think I would say going into community meetings, and I do still use community meetings in projects, but I think one of the things is, like, how do we create the conditions for community meetings to be generative spaces where we're in conversation, as opposed to transactional meetings where we're telling people what we're going to do. Because I think, I'll often go in when I'm speaking to like professionals and ask, how many of you have always consistently, or most of the time consistently, great experiences with with community meetings? I maybe get a lone hand, right? Like, because I think we're often used to them being places where there's a lot of conflict. And I think like a lot of it happens to be with like communities are used to folks not coming to them unless they need something or as a transactional check the box. And so they feel like I've got to yell or I've got to do this thing because this may be the only time that I get to see you and I need to make myself heard. So I never put community meetings as the first thing we do because I feel like we have not set up the relational piece to be able to have something that is different than that transactional conversation. So the storytelling is a huge, story collecting is a huge thing, going in and doing interviews with like representative sample of stakeholders first to start to build relationships and understand the context. In the Now Hundreds Point project, after we had collected a few stories, we held listening parties, and those operated as a form of community meetings. The activations that I talked about, I treat them as community meetings. I'll do focus groups with youth to also get their input. I even did, in the Hunters Point project, we partnered up with a local group that did summer school for kids and did a kite making workshop. But the kites were actually a tool to actually talk about some of the things that they wanted to see on the site. What else have I done? Yeah, there's some. Does that help?
I really like the idea of the park for a day concept that you had for like bringing community in and having them like, interact with the space before it's even built. Is that going to be something you kind of carry over to future projects, or do you think you got more out of it, or are there some limitations to that idea that you weren't expecting that maybe won't allow it to be brought into the future?
I mean, I would bring it in if it was a thing that made sense in the context of the community and the space that we were working on. Everything, and also because I knew, so it is going to take years before redevelopment can happen on that highway. So one of the things that the city has expressed interest in is potentially doing interim activation on that land. So doing the park for the day was also to test how the heck do we get people down to a highway? Would they actually come, right? So that I could give insight to the client about what to do with it. There was a lot of learning that happened as a result of that event. But I think, I've done it on a couple of projects. And like I said, if it was appropriate for the context of the project, then it's great. If it was not, then I look for other activations that we can pop up with. So I really, I use activation a lot, but the ideas of the activation are usually born of both sets of clients, like kind of interest and capacities of what they could sustain. And usually they will come after the interview pieces that I mentioned before. So I'm already, so it's not like I go and I see that. I mean, I did see that piece of land. I was like, oh, cool, wouldn't it be great to be on it? But I didn't necessarily plan what the thing was we could do until I had conversations with people. And then I was like, oh yeah, that would be a good idea because people have talked about this as potentially a future for the thing. So it's still always born of conversations with people first. And then, those conversations also dictated some of the pieces that were part of the park pop-up. Mm-hmm.
So my question is it part of your work to prepare communities to maintain what you build? And if yes, how do you go about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, they're all great questions. Yeah, I think the part of me staying with the community for a long period of time is also to be there post us building things so that we can actually see what kinds of things need to be changed or adjusted. And I do take kind of the long-term maintenance into account as we're thinking through what the ideas are. It's like, who's going to be a steward? Is this a thing that they can actually afford to be a steward to? The Kindlewood project is really interesting because it's a phased project. You know, we now have phase 1 that has been built, and there were many amazing things to it, and there were also some things that have been like really hard that we've been having to like work around, right? Like, so the site has at least where we built phase 1, has a kind of complicated topography thing, and to try to honor the desires of those, there were some townhouses that were built on that, and in order to honor the desire of the advisory committee and the design of like, we want everybody who has a townhouse to have a front door on the street. In order to do that, there's a crazy number of stairs in the design. And when we were in the design process, we tried, we pulled out sections and axons and all of these things to try to like think through trade-offs and ask people like, are you sure this is what you want? These are some other options. And they like, well, no, highest and best use is to have a stair that exits out on the street on either side. So that resulted in a lot of stairs. So when the thing was built and they saw the stairs, they were like, why would we ever want to have that many stairs? You didn't design it, right? So it was clear they hadn't fully understood what we tried to show them. And so it's built. There's not much we can do about that. It led to some people choosing to go into the multifamily building instead. But we were able to take the learnings from that. So when we were designing phase 2 and phase 3, we're like, okay, we have some similar topography issues here. You noted that it was really hard to have all those stairs. Now we're back to making these decisions. What do you want to do? So it's not to say that we always hit the nail on the head right the first time, but and a lot of my projects tend to be iterative, that in doing these iterative ways, we're able to, and even the prototyping of activation is sometimes to test like assumptions of how something might work. And if we see that it doesn't, we use, instead of being like, oh crap, we totally failed, it's like, how do we use that failure as a learning opportunity to be able to improve it upon the next one? And I often say that some of the goals of prototyping or being able to do things in a phased way is to de-risk failure, and that's for both sets of clients. Like I think sometimes for the client who pays, it's hard to take a risk because that's a lot of money and I don't know if that's going to work and I haven't been able to see where it's been done before. And so if we do things as a prototype, it's like, if it doesn't work, we can pivot, we can learn from it and pivot. And then with the other set of clients, I think often what I've found with historically marginalized populations is like they're often dealing with conditions where margins are very tight. And taking a risk is a luxury. And so by trying to sort of narrow the zone of risk taking, the idea is to like create an opportunity where we can always make a change if a thing doesn't work, but it's not like, oh my God, that's my entire life that you have like imploded. So, sorry, it's an expanded version of answering your question, but I think the idea is like being in relationship long enough that you are past the point where the door is open, so to speak, and then trying to take things as small bites so you have an opportunity to pivot for the next iteration.
Yeah, well, thank you for your talk and coming here. My question is regarding building trust with the community. Are there certain skills or tools you think that we should be talking about in college here to our students that they can help them when they get out into practice that will allow them to be better stewards for these types of conversations with the community?
Yes.
Like buried within that.
Yeah. I mean, I will also acknowledge that you're working within a semester system, and that's a tight period of time to build relationships with communities and be able to accomplish things. So I'm giving that as a caveat. I think some of the skills of building trust with community are the skills that we all use to have friends and be in relationship with family members, right? Like, I think it's not approaching them from this power position, but it's someone that I want to know, right? Like invariably in my conversations, I never start with, what do you want to see here? I actually start with like, who are you? Like, what do you care about? Where are you from? What do you do? Like, getting to know people and deep listening. So I think whatever skills you can add that are around deep listening and taking that in, that is great. I also, for many years, I taught and was on the board of this program called Design Futures, which you all can join if you want to, which was a national university consortium which brought together students from universities across the country, usually 10 to 14 every year, rotates at different schools. It's a week-long program where master classes are taught about how to do exactly this kind of work. And one of the courses that I taught consistently there was this power and privilege workshop. Because one of the things that I think is whether it's in your position now as students going out into communities or when you become professionals, you have more power than the community inherently through the process, right? Anytime something you can do, something that you can say, or a line that you can draw can actually shift a community's experience, that means you have power. And so part of, I think, learning to be able to be a good actor in communities is learning to understand your own power and privilege and learning the ways that it bubbles up, sometimes unconsciously in the conversations, and thinking about how do you step back when you can, and if you leverage your power, how do you do it in a way that supports the growth of the community members' power? And so it's a complicated thing to learn in some ways, but it's also, I think, required to do this work intentionally, right? And I think the other thing I would say is to also understand that there will be times where you totally fail and get it wrong, which I know is not a thing we ever want to deal with as students, but like, how do you cope with that failure? And how do you cope with sometimes that the thing you may try to do may not actually match what the community needs, right? And that the thing to be designed may not be a building or a landscape or a plan, and how a skill in terms of both coming back and learning from failure, but also how to apply our design skills to things that impact the built environment, but aren't necessarily pieces of the built environment, if that makes sense, right? That list of things that I listed that I did for the Kindlewood project last week, they all take my design skills, but they're not what I was like necessarily specifically taught in school. So like how we use that creative mindset and treat everything as kind of a design problem that is deserving of our creativity. So the more that you can put students in situations where the project has that broader remit of understanding, I think it gives a good practice for when they get out in the world. Go here and then here.
Along the same lines of cultivating relationships with clients who are the community and occupants, can you speak to how you navigate cultivating a relationship with a client who's the financial holder, who may be a little bit skeptical of your quote-unquote like unconventional practice that may be a little bit longer?
Yes. So I would say I use, in some ways, the exact same process, right? Like I think the people who represent the client base are people too. And so part of my relationship building is actually with them, getting to know their history, how they showed up into this job. Because if I can understand what their motivations are, that allows me to address sometimes where we may be at loggerheads, because I can see the person behind that and not just the role that might be confronting. So for instance, on the utility company project, one of the biggest issues is they're like, we're a utility company. We don't do community development, right? They do community meetings. That was their very traditional thing. But the types of stuff that we were doing would make their heads explode. And so part of it was like getting to know the team we were working on that client side to understand like what was important to them, what constituted success. So one of them actually grew up in the neighborhood. So for her, success was actually seeing the neighborhood thrive. So when we talk about issues, we connect the dots for her so she could see how this neighborhood that she was actually passionate about actually could be able to be better based on the risks that we were taking. For others, they were like, I don't know how to justify this within the company, but what success in the company is me being seen as a good steward of this site, right? And not causing any problems for the company. And so instead of talking about what we were doing as community development, we talked about it as site maintenance. So if we said, look, you're normally going to spend this much money to protect the site with fencing and a security company. But if we do these events here, the community actually sees it as a site that they want to caretake. So we might actually save you money because the number of incursions on the site would not be as great. So this was just another way to think of site maintenance. There's also like reputational support. So somebody being able to say, I just attended a circus, or there was this amazing job training workshop on that site, is probably better than some of the other calls that normally come in because of what happens on an untended site, or the fact that it would be vacant for so many years. And so once it was like an act of translation. Once we put it in those terms, like, oh yeah, I get it, okay, I can see it. The other thing of what I talked about in the answer to the other question of de-risking failure, by taking this small little thing, it was also like, I'm not asking you to roll the dice for this huge thing. I'm asking you to try just this small thing. And if it doesn't work, it's not like it's cost us that much in terms of money or energy. So I think those are two strategies. And then the other one, I would say, that's part of the relational building is there's kind of a running joke on all my projects that I'm the one person everybody trusts. Like, doesn't matter who they are in the thing. And it's because, I would say for those who are the client who pays, they trust that I have their best interests at heart, even as I am advocating for these things from the community. And so it's like, how do you build the relationship that, like that deep listening that I just mentioned, they feel like you have listened to them, and that when I put the problem solving aspect, I'm trying to think about how to achieve the aims that you need in ways that also support the community. And I'm always thinking about the two. And sometimes I will push back, right? But they trust that even as I'm pushing back, it's not because I'm not considering their needs, right? And so even if we have a disagreement, that baseline of trust continues. And also, it's only happened maybe 2-3 times. Clients know, if I ultimately don't agree with the values of things, I'll walk, right? I do so in a fair and kind way. But that it's not that I'll just keep on being a pushover if the thing doesn't work or doesn't represent the values. And so I think they all should trust that ethical compass as well. And then the last thing I would say is I think at the end of the day, I was going to say everybody, but I'll just say most people genuinely want to do good. And I think they are often finding themselves in positions that they have to make a choice between doing good and doing their job. And so I treat part of the design problem is to shift how doing good and doing their job can be in alignment.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I kind of mentioned parts of what I was going to ask. I was going to say, how would you approach a design for communities that are experiencing ongoing violence? And the second question is, what is it like a mistake that young designers would do while thinking of social justice?
Yeah. So I think when communities are facing ongoing violence, it is really hard to, so much of our work is about building the thing in the future. And I think it's hard for people to be in the place of the future when they are being actively harmed in the present. So I often would treat that as a form of some of the project is actually not designing the future thing. It's designing what offers refuge and respite in the present. A lot of my work, I didn't talk about it as much with the Akron project, but a lot of that was like, what is the grief that is going on? And we like literally slowed the project down, especially after Jalen Walker's killing, to just hold space for people being in grief. Like I led a couple of grief circles. And actually those circles deepened the trust between the particular groups that they were being held with, because it was like, oh, you're grieving too, and you're letting me see that, and I feel like I can share my grief with you, and you're holding it. And so it actually did create things that I think will support the longer term project. And it's hard because we live in a capitalist society, and there's an end goal of doing the thing. But I think part of the thing that I would say is like, we can only move where the people are ready to go. And sometimes we need to add new projects to the remit if that's what it takes to create a space where people can get some relief and be able to move in a better way. So it's the willingness to shift what your goal is and broaden it to encompass the things that might be needed right now. And then remind me of the second question.
What is a mistake that young designers do while thinking of social justice in architecture?
Yeah, okay. You all really want to do good. And it's great. And I think sometimes, good intentions aren't always anchored in good practices. And I often say that there's a difference between doing good and doing right. And doing good is about how it makes you feel, and doing right is about what's for the greater good. And I think doing good is often the easier action. And so it's like, how do you hold enough space to understand what right is? And that means thinking about what is needed, what is required beyond you and how you might feel. Sometimes the thing that is required is for you to just step out. And you have to be willing to do that. And so it's like, how are you consistently asking the question of what is right here? There's a project on my website that I did with this kind of renegade band of people, and the center, we worked with the Center for Urban Pedagogy, and it's called Dick and Rick, and we joked that the not so secret subtitle is How Not to Be a Dick. And we basically took the old Goofus and Gallant cartoons, which you all are far too young to remember. But basically what it used to be is that Gallant would show you they would both be in the same situation. Goofus would show you the not right way to do it. Gallant would show you the right way to do it. So in the case of Dick and Rick, we take trying to develop a park on an empty lot in a community. And Dick is like, oh my God, I sees it on the news, and I can go and help. I have architecture skills. Let me go. So he goes and looks at the lot. When he holds a community meeting, he's showing the design he's going to do. When he builds a beautiful park, it gets in a magazine, right? Like all the things that we would say you should do. But notice and this was a brilliant thing from our illustrator, she came up with this idea, when you look at the park, there's no one in it. Rick sees the same story about the empty lot on the news and finds a community meeting that's already happening about something else in the neighborhood, and goes and sits and listens and realizes, oh, actually, even though it's a community, there's differing views. Not everybody thinks about the same thing. And when he pulls people together, understands, well, some of my job here is just to listen, and some of my job is like, how could I find the common ground between these different groups? And then when he starts to build, actually brings in community members to build, so that at the end, his park is full of people, not in a magazine, but you see kids, the youth group who helped build it is like, I built this park, or I want to go and build a farm stand. And so in some ways they both started off of like very genuine desires, but the doing good versus doing right. So I think I would always just ask, how are you making sure that you're deeply listening? The power and privilege piece that I mentioned before is like, how are you deploying your power and privilege, and how are you making sure that you're honoring the community as the like kind of highest voice of what happens, and how do you also take heed at the moments where you need to exit the situation or step back because what is not needed is you in this particular point in time.
I think we are good. Thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everybody, for your wonderful questions.